The storm was meant to erase it all. The blood, the guilt, the bond between a father and the son who swore he'd never come home again. But when a wounded canine dragged itself to an old cabin door, destiny knocked with frozen paws. From the darkness stepped Frank Walker, a retired Marine haunted by a fire that took everything he loved. And somewhere in the snow, his son, a young cop betrayed and left to die, was waiting to learn the truth he'd buried for years. That night, bullets fell like prayers, and one man's sacrifice turned a storm into a miracle. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and if you believe that God still sends angels disguised as dogs, tap subscribe. The wind howled through the pines, scattering loose snow like silver dust across the frozen valley. Inside a lonely cabin at the edge of the Wyoming woods, Frank Walker crouched beside a flickering wood stove, his rough hands working a stubborn latch. The man was built like the mountains around him. Broad shoulders, weathered face, a jaw that still held the quiet discipline of a Marine. His gray-streaked beard framed a mouth that rarely smiled, and his eyes, a steel blue dulled by years of silence, seemed to be always watching something that wasn't there. Frank had lived alone for nearly a decade, after losing his wife in a house fire and his son, Ethan, to a silence colder than any winter. He had learned to keep his thoughts as orderly as his tools, yet sometimes, in the stillness of night, the ghosts of Iraq and the echo of his son's last words came crawling back. That night, as the wind screamed through the trees, Frank heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A dog's bark, sharp and desperate, slicing through the blizzard like a distress call. He froze. In this part of the valley, there were no neighbors for miles. The bark came again, closer this time, frantic, alive. Frank grabbed his flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, boots sinking into the knee-high snow. The beam of light cut through the swirling white, and there, staggering up the slope, came a German shepherd, its coat matted with ice and blood, its breath steaming in violent puffs. The dog collapsed at his feet with a soft whine, then forced itself up again, grabbing the cuff of Frank's jacket between its teeth and pulling, not in aggression, but urgency. "Easy, boy," Frank muttered, lowering the flashlight. The tag on the collar glinted in the beam. Ranger, K9 Unit, Sheriff Department. Frank's chest tightened. The Sheriff's Department meant Ethan, his son. He hadn't heard his voice in 5 years. Not since the funeral, not since the accusation that still burned between them. The storm roared, snow piling around his boots, and the dog tugged harder, eyes wild with desperation. Frank's instincts, the old, unbreakable ones from the battlefield, kicked in. He rushed inside, grabbed his thick parka, the old sidearm he had promised never to use again, and a heavy beam flashlight. He looked once more at the photo on the mantel, a younger man in a uniform, Ethan at 12 holding a fishing rod, and a woman with auburn hair laughing into the wind. "God help me," Frank whispered. Then he followed the dog into the storm. The forest swallowed them whole. The world was white noise, wind, snow, and the rhythmic panting of the dog limping ahead. Ranger's gait was uneven. One paw dragged slightly, leaving a smeared trail of blood. Yet he didn't stop. Frank followed the prints, his breath harsh and shallow. The cold bit deep into his skin, but something stronger than pain kept him moving. Fear. Fear that this dog, this bleeding soldier of a different kind, had come from something tied to his son. A mile down the slope, the trees opened into a clearing. There, half buried under snow, lay a wrecked police SUV, its lights dim, its siren muted by the storm. The doors were open, the windshield shattered, and the smell of gasoline lingered faintly in the frozen air. Ranger ran to it, barking wildly, circling once before pawing at the ground near the driver's side. Frank knelt, shining his light inside. The seats were streaked with blood. A police badge lay twisted on the floor, half covered in ice. The nameplate was scratched, but the first 3 letters were clear. Eth. His throat went dry. "Ethan," he breathed, barely audible under the storm. He felt his pulse quicken, his heart hammering against his ribs. Ranger whined, pressing his muzzle against the driver's seat, then turned and barked toward the tree line, as if commanding Frank to follow. The old Marine moved on instinct. His boots crunched through snow, his flashlight slicing the darkness. Ranger led him down a narrow path through the pines, past broken branches and a faint trail of footprints half erased by the wind. The dog's tail flicked anxiously, his body tense but unwavering. Frank's breath came in ragged bursts, every step feeling like a march back into the war he thought he'd left behind. He reached a bend where the forest opened onto the riverbank. There, in the dim light, he saw drag marks. Someone had been pulled through the snow. Frank's chest constricted. He crouched and touched the frozen imprint of a hand, half filled with snow, and his fingers trembled. "Hang on, son," he whispered. "Just hang on." Ranger barked sharply, his eyes fixed on something ahead, a faint glow behind a cluster of trees. Frank raised his gun, moving slowly, his breath fogging in front of him. As he neared the light, he realized it came from an old storage barn, abandoned years ago after a fire. The padlock hung broken, and tire tracks disappeared behind it. Ranger growled low, the sound vibrating through the cold air. Frank steadied his breathing. The weight of the pistol felt heavier than he remembered. The storm had softened into silence, a false calm before revelation. He glanced at the dog, its ears back, body quivering with restrained fear. "All right, Ranger," he murmured, voice rough but resolute. "Let's find my boy." He stepped toward the barn door, snow crunching beneath his boots. The light inside flickered once, then went out. The forest had turned into a maze of white and shadow. Snow clung to the branches like frozen ash, and every gust of wind carried a low, mournful howl through the pines. Frank Walker moved carefully, one gloved hand gripping his flashlight, the other holding his pistol low and steady. The beam caught streaks of crimson against the snow, thin at first, then heavier, leading down the narrow path. Behind him, Ranger limped but pressed on, his breath clouding the air in bursts. The dog's dark coat was dusted with ice, his amber eyes burning with determination, never once glancing back. Frank followed, his boots crunching in rhythm with the beating of his heart. He could feel the storm closing in around them like a living thing, but the trail of blood pulled him forward, relentless, magnetic, and terrible. When the trees finally broke, Frank stopped cold. There, half buried under a sheet of snow, was the police SUV. The same one he'd glimpsed earlier, but now close enough to see the shattered glass, the black scorch marks, and a trail of drag prints leading toward an abandoned structure deeper in the woods. The warehouse loomed like a rusted skeleton. Its roof collapsed in parts, its windows dark with grime. A faint orange glow flickered inside. Ranger's ears perked up, and he gave a low growl. Frank crouched behind a fallen log, scanning the perimeter. Two men with rifles stood by the side entrance, stamping their boots against the cold, their laughter faint but cruel. Frank's jaw tightened. He recognized their insignia. The red viper patch of Rico Vance, a name he hadn't heard in years. Rico had once been the charismatic face of a charity fund during the war, a man who'd offered medical shipments to transport zones. Frank, then a young Marine desperate to help, had agreed to escort a few of those trucks. Months later, when the truth broke, that the shipments carried narcotics, Rico vanished. And the night the police came to question Frank, someone set fire to his home. His wife died in that blaze. His son, Ethan, never forgave him. Now, standing in the snow, Frank realized the circle had closed. Rico was alive, and his son was inside that building. He moved silently, hugging the shadows. The snow muffled every sound, but Frank's senses were razor sharp. Ranger crawled low beside him, wincing at each step, but obeying every hand signal like a soldier. They reached the side of the warehouse. Through a cracked window, Frank saw Ethan. The young man was slumped in a metal chair, wrists tied, his face bruised and bleeding. His dark hair, shorter than Frank remembered, was matted with sweat. His uniform shirt was torn, badge missing, and one eye was nearly swollen shut. Yet, even in that state, his posture was defiant. Standing over him was Rico Vance, tall, lean, with slicked back hair, now streaked gray at the temples. His smile was a serpent's grin, polished and venomous. A gold ring glinted on his finger as he paced in front of Ethan. "You've got your mother's eyes," Rico said, his voice calm, almost nostalgic. "Too bad you got your father's temper." Ethan spat blood onto the floor. "Where is she buried, you piece of garbage?" Rico chuckled. "Buried? Oh, son, she wasn't meant to die. Your old man just picked the wrong night to play the hero. He was supposed to drive one more load for me, and when he refused, well, accidents happen. He crouched closer, lowering his voice. Didn't he ever tell you that? That your sweet mother burned because of him? Ethan's breath hitched. For a moment, the anger in his eyes turned to something else. Disbelief, maybe fear, before twisting back into rage. You're lying. Rico straightened, smirking. Am I? Outside the window, Frank's fingers tightened around his gun. The air around him felt thinner, heavier. He could barely breathe. Ranger whimpered softly, sensing the tremor in his master's body. Inside, Rico grabbed Ethan by the collar. You want truth? Ask your daddy. He was one of mine. The words struck like a bullet. Frank's vision blurred, the edges of the world dimmed for a moment. He remembered the smell of diesel, the crackle of fire, his wife's scream behind the locked door. For years, he'd carried that guilt alone, believing silence was his punishment. But hearing it now, twisted into Rico's cruelty, ignited something deep within him. Frank moved. Quick, silent, precise. He crept around to the rear entrance, spotting a guard standing with his back turned, cigarette glowing faintly. In one swift motion, Frank covered the man's mouth and pulled him backward into the snow, snapping his neck with a muted crack. The body went limp. Ranger stood by, eyes alert, waiting. They slipped through the open service door. Inside, the air smelled of rust and gasoline. Frank could hear the muffled rhythm of Rico's voice echoing off the walls. He crouched behind an old generator, raised his gun, and took aim. Then, a bark. Soft, unintentional, but enough. Ranger's injured paw had brushed a loose can. One of Rico's men turned. Hey, who's there? Frank fired once. The man dropped. Chaos erupted. Rico spun toward the sound, drawing his pistol. Ethan lunged sideways, toppling the chair just as bullets tore through the space where he'd been. Frank charged in, firing twice more, hitting one thug in the shoulder. Ranger leapt forward, teeth flashing, bringing another man down. Ethan froze mid-crawl, staring at the figure emerging from the smoke. The outline of a man older, grayer, but unmistakable. Dad? He whispered. Frank grabbed him, cutting the rope around his wrists. We have to move, now. But Ethan didn't move. His voice shook, rough and full of venom. You caused this. Mom's death, all of it. Frank met his gaze, pain flickering in his eyes. Not tonight, son. We'll talk when you're, safe. Ranger whined between them, tail low, glancing from father to son. The sound carried more sorrow than any word could. Outside, the storm howled again, as if echoing the turmoil that neither man could silence. The storm came back with a vengeance, sweeping through the valley like a living beast. Wind howled through the gaps in the warehouse roof, hurling flakes of snow inside like shards of broken glass. The generator had long gone silent, leaving only the low moan of the blizzard and the faint rasp of Ranger's breathing. The dog lay near the wall, one leg wrapped with a torn strip of Ethan's uniform, his chest rising and falling unevenly. Each exhale came with a soft whimper that made even the storm seem quieter. Frank Walker sat by the broken window, eyes fixed on the white abyss outside. His silhouette, broad, stoic, looked carved from the same iron as his pistol. He had reloaded twice, checked the exits 3 times, and still couldn't silence the storm inside his chest. Across the room, Ethan leaned against a metal shelf, rubbing the raw skin on his wrists where the ropes had bitten deep. His face was bruised, streaked with blood and sweat. Yet his eyes, green like his mother's, were sharp with suspicion and anger. Once the wind drops, Ethan muttered, I'll head east, find the highway, call in backup. Frank didn't turn. You won't make it 2 miles. Roads are buried. Radios are jammed. We move now. We die. Ethan laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. So I'm supposed to trust you now? The man who worked with the same bastards who killed Mom? Frank's jaw tightened. I didn't know what was in those trucks. I was a soldier following orders. Yeah? Ethan stepped forward, voice rising. And when the fire came? When she screamed for you and you didn't come back? Was that following orders too? The words cut deeper than bullets. Frank's hand trembled slightly, the flashlight beam shaking across the floor. You think I didn't try? He said, his his voice breaking through the anger. "I ran into that house 3 times. The last thing I saw was her, your mother, behind that door, and the flames swallowed it whole. I pulled you out first, because she begged me to." For a moment, the only sound was the wind pressing against the tin walls. Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. The old ache in Frank's heart swelled, the same pain he'd buried under 10 winters of silence. Ethan turned away, clenching his fists. "Then prove it. You say you're innocent. Prove it. Give me something that isn't just words." Frank exhaled slowly, as though letting go of decades of guilt. He reached into the inside pocket of his parka and pulled out a small envelope, the edges singed black. The paper was brittle, stained with soot. He handed it over without a word. Ethan hesitated before unfolding it. The handwriting was shaky, familiar. He had seen it once before, on birthday cards and lunch notes tucked into his backpack as a boy. The letter read, "If anything happens, don't blame your father. He only wanted to keep us safe. Whatever he did it for you." Ethan's breath caught. His vision blurred as tears stung the corners of his eyes. Not just grief, but confusion, shame, disbelief, all tangled together. He looked at Frank, who stood silently in the pale light seeping through the cracked wall. There was no defense left in the old man's posture, no pride, just the quiet surrender of someone too tired to run from his own shadow. Ranger stirred, sensing the shift in the room. The dog dragged himself forward, resting his heavy head on Ethan's knee, eyes soft and knowing. Ethan's hand shook as he stroked the rough fur, the warmth grounding him back to something human. Outside, thunder rolled, not from the sky, but from engines. Frank's head snapped toward the window. Faint lights flickered in the distance, moving through the snow. "They found us," he said. Ethan wiped his face quickly, tucking the letter into his vest. "How many?" "Too many," Frank replied. He checked his weapon, motion crisp and efficient, the Marine instinct returning. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they surround the place." Ethan pulled his own gun from a fallen guard's holster. "We can't stay. There's an old supply tunnel behind the furnace, leads down toward the river. I saw it when they dragged me in." Frank nodded, impressed despite himself. "You always had your mother's eyes. She saw everything." Ethan gave a short, broken laugh. "And your stubbornness." For the first time, they shared a glance, not filled with hatred, only weary understanding. Outside, headlights cut through the storm, beams swaying like ghosts, searching for the living. Frank crouched beside Ranger. "Can he walk?" Ethan knelt, examining the bandaged leg. "Barely, but he'll try." Ranger pushed himself up, tail wagging once, faint but defiant. Frank's throat tightened. "Good boy," he whispered. A distant shout echoed through the storm. Men calling, boots crunching over snow. The trap was closing. Frank moved toward the back door. "Stay behind me. If they breach from the front, we take the tunnel." Ethan nodded, gripping his weapon. "Then what?" "Then," Frank said, looking at him with quiet resolve, "we stop running from the past." The wind howled again, rattling the walls. Somewhere beyond the trees, Rico's convoy roared closer, bringing with it the ghosts Frank thought he'd buried long ago. Inside the collapsing warehouse, father, son, and dog stood together for the first time. Not reconciled, not forgiven, but united by necessity, waiting for the storm to break. The night had turned brutal. Wind slashed through the broken windows of the warehouse, and the snow fell heavier than ever, each flake a tiny whisper of death. In the distance, engines growled like wolves circling their prey. Frank Walker tightened the strap of his rifle, the scars on his hands stark against the steel. His face was pale from the cold, but his eyes burned with that grim steadiness of a man who'd seen war too many times. Ethan, crouched near a shattered truck, loaded his sidearm with trembling fingers. His breath came in harsh clouds, but his focus was sharp. Somewhere between fear and duty, something inside him had changed. Ranger, the German shepherd, limped to the doorway. His fur, once a proud mix of black and tan, was matted with blood. Yet his stance was unyielding, tail stiff, eyes locked on the tree line. His low growl rolled through the room like thunder beneath the storm. "They're surrounding us," Ethan said, his voice a controlled whisper. Frank gave a nod. "We hold until they break formation, then we move." Outside, faint shadows flickered. Men spreading through the storm, flashlights cutting lines through the snow. The unmistakable figure of Rico Vance emerged last. Even blurred by the blizzard, his arrogance was unmistakable. Tall, clean-cut in black tactical gear, a smirk carved into his stubbled face. Once, Frank had hauled freight for him, back when he believed he was carrying relief supplies, not poison. Rico had smiled then, too. "Frank Walker," Rico's voice cut through the storm like a blade. "Always knew you'd crawl back out of your hole eventually. You cost me a fortune back then, old man." Frank pressed his back against the wall, his breath steady. "You burned my home. You killed my wife." "Collateral damage," Rico called, almost casually. "But you were my best soldier. Pity your boy here didn't learn loyalty from you." Ethan's grip on his weapon tightened until his knuckles went white. "You're done, Vance." A burst of gunfire answered him. Bullets ripped through the wooden siding, showering splinters into the air. Ranger barked furiously, leaping back. Frank returned fire, aiming low, controlled bursts that sent two figures sprawling. Ethan tossed a smoke grenade out the side door. Within seconds, the world dissolved into thick, gray chaos. "Move left," Frank shouted. Ethan darted toward the old truck, using its frame for cover. Shots cracked around him, echoing like thunder in a canyon. Ranger stayed close to Frank's side, teeth bared, his growl a constant rumble. Then, from the veil of smoke, Rico appeared, his pistol raised, steps silent as a shadow. He aimed directly at Ethan. "Say goodbye, kid." The flash came first, the muzzle flare, brilliant against the storm. Frank didn't think. Instinct overrode pain, logic, everything. He lunged, body colliding with his son's, just as the shot rang out. The impact stole his breath, hot fire. Spreading through his ribs, he fell into the snow, crimson blooming beneath him like a dark flower. "Dad!" Ethan's voice broke. Ranger's snarl turned feral. The dog launched forward, a streak of fury and loyalty. His jaws clamped onto Rico's arm, the sound of tearing fabric and flesh drowned by the blizzard's roar. Rico screamed, twisting, trying to aim, but Ethan was already moving. He raised his pistol and fired twice. The second shot found its mark. Rico collapsed into the snow, his smirk erased forever. The world went quiet, save for the wind. Ethan dropped beside Frank, pressing his hands against the wound. Blood seeped through his fingers, warm and terrifying. Frank's breath came in ragged bursts, his eyes half-lidded, but still calm. "Now you know," Frank whispered, voice fading. "I never wanted to lose her. Or you." Ethan's throat tightened, words stumbled out between sobs. I'm sorry, Dad. I was wrong. I should have believed you." Frank's hand trembled, reaching up to rest on his son's shoulder. "No, son. This was our second chance. Don't waste it." Ranger limped to Frank's side, lowering his head, licking the man's trembling hand as if begging him to stay. Frank smiled faintly, eyes softening. "Good boy," he murmured. "You kept your promise." The snow fell heavier now, muffling the distant echoes of battle. The warehouse door creaked, half torn from its hinges, letting in a rush of icy wind. Ethan bent closer, clutching his father's hand, until it went still. Ranger whimpered once, a sound so human it pierced the storm. Ethan turned his gaze upward. The blizzard swirled around them like ghosts ascending to heaven. For a long moment, he stayed kneeling in the snow, the letter from his mother pressed against his chest, the truth finally clear. The storm would pass, but this moment, his father's sacrifice, would never fade. Morning broke like a slow miracle over the frozen valley. The storm had finally spent itself, leaving the world hushed and white. Snowdrifts glittered under the first rays of dawn, soft as spilled light. The old warehouse, now scarred and half collapsed, stood silent, its walls holding echoes of gunfire and redemption. Police cruisers lined the narrow road, red and blue lights flashing faintly against the pale sky. Rico Vance lay in handcuffs beside the wreckage of his empire, his arrogance drained, his voice silenced at last. The officers moved quietly, respectful of the man who had stopped him, Frank Walker, now being carried into an ambulance, blood seeping through the bandage on his shoulder. Ethan watched from the steps of the barn, his face streaked with dirt and grief. The storm had stolen so much, Yet somehow, it had also given something back. Beside him, Ranger sat obediently, his coat brushed clean but still patchy from healing wounds. The dog's amber eyes followed every movement of the medics, his ears twitching each time Frank's stretcher shifted. When the ambulance door closed, Ethan's chest tightened. "You'll make it, old man," he whispered, voice cracking. Ranger nudged his leg, as if agreeing, then leaned against him, warmth against the cold. Weeks passed. Winter softened its grip. The snow on the fields melted into silver streams that ran between the fences of Frank's ranch. The sky turned pale blue again, and the mountains lost their angry edge. Ethan sat on the porch, the wooden steps creaking softly beneath his boots. He was still in uniform, but the badge no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. Ranger sprawled nearby, chewing on a stick, tail sweeping lazy arcs in the snow. Ethan looked down at the scar on his wrist where Rico's men had tied him. It had faded, but the memory hadn't. Some nights, he still woke to the echo of gunfire, only to find Ranger lying beside the bed, head resting across his chest, the steady rhythm of his breathing anchoring him to the present. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the morning stillness. Ethan lifted his head. A pickup truck rolled up the path, its old engine coughing in protest. The driver's door opened, and Frank stepped down slowly. He still wore a sling across his arm, and his gait was careful. But there was life in his stride, the quiet kind that comes from surviving what should have been the end. For a heartbeat, they just stared at each other. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was full of things that no words could quite hold. Ethan rose from the porch. "You shouldn't be driving yet," he said softly, though the reprimand carried no weight. Frank gave a crooked smile. "Doc said I should take short trips. I figured this one was worth it." The two men stood facing each other, snow crunching beneath their boots. Ethan's lips parted, but the words tangled in his throat. Finally, he just moved forward. One hesitant step, then another, until he closed the distance and wrapped his arms around his father. The hug was awkward at first, stiff with years of pride and misunderstanding. Then it broke open, raw and real. "I thought I was strong," Ethan murmured, his voice muffled against Frank's shoulder. "But I was just a lost son, too angry to see the truth." Frank's good hand came up, resting gently on the back of Ethan's neck. "You're strong because you kept going," he said. "But it's all right to be lost, son. Sometimes God lets us wander so we can find our way home." A bark broke the moment. Ranger bounded toward them, tail whipping the air. He circled twice, barking joyfully, then leapt up against Frank's chest. Frank chuckled, wincing a little. "Easy, boy. Still got a few holes in me." He reached down, ruffling the thick fur between the dog's ears. "You found me, didn't you? Guess the Lord sent you to bring my boy home." Ethan smiled through the tears that threatened again. "Yeah, guess he did." The three of them lingered there for a while. No more words, just the quiet comfort of being alive together. The wind carried the scent of pine and thawing earth. Somewhere far off, a hawk called over the valley, its cry fading into the distance. Frank took a slow breath, his eyes following the horizon. "You ever think about leaving the badge behind? Maybe stay here a while?" Ethan hesitated. "Maybe. I think for the first time I could." Frank nodded. "Then we'll rebuild. Not just the ranch." His gaze softened. "Us." Ranger trotted ahead into the open field, his paws kicking up small bursts of snow that glimmered in the sun. Father and son followed side by side, their shadows long across the white expanse. The sunlight poured down golden and forgiving, melting what remained of the storm. At the edge of the clearing, Ranger stopped. He turned back toward them, ears perked, eyes bright. Then he barked once, a sharp, clear sound that echoed across the valley, not in alarm, but in triumph. Ethan looked at Frank, smiling through the warmth in his eyes. Frank's hand rested on his son's shoulder, steady and proud. Together, they walked into the light, three silhouettes against a field of white, the past finally laid to rest, and the promise of peace stretching endlessly ahead. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or light from the heavens. They come quietly, through love, loyalty, and forgiveness. Frank didn't survive because he was strong. He survived because grace found him, through his son, and through a faithful creature sent at just the right moment. Maybe that's how God works, not through grand signs, but through small mercies that change everything. And perhaps, somewhere in our own storms, the ones no one else can see, He's already sending us our own ranger, a light to guide us home. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are real. Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith and redemption, and may God bless you and everyone you love, tonight and always.